Okay, welcome to our next BIOL3468 Biodiversity and Conservation lecture. In this lecture I want to take a look at global biodiversity and some of the processes which has given rise to global biodiversity, and also some of the processes which occur to maintain that global biodiversity. Okay, so during this lecture I want to take a look at some of the processes. I want to take a look at some of the natural processes regulating biodiversity. But before that I want to see some of the reasons why biodiversity has reached the level that we see it at today. As I said in a previous lecture, biodiversity, up until humans started messing up the planet, was at its highest level that it has ever been in the history of life on Earth. So biodiversity has consistently increased over geological time, from the Silurian geological period all the way up to the tertiary geological period. Biodiversity has just increased, and I want to take a look at why this is so. And then I want to take a look at some of the reasons why people think that biodiversity is as high as it is, and in particular why biodiversity is high in particular parts of the world. Okay? So what I want to first look at is global biodiversity in the geological past. I want to take a look at how biodiversity has changed in the fossil record over geological times. Now I talked about this a little bit in previous lectures. I mentioned that there has been an increase in biodiversity, and in this lecture I want to go into some of the reasons or the hypotheses that people believe that there is, or there has been, an increase in biodiversity over time. Okay, basically the fossil record indicates alternating periods of biodiversity explosions, or massive increases of fossil species, alternating with periods where there have been mass extinctions and massive loss of fossil species. The reasons for the explosions in biodiversity is not really understood, as is the reasons for the mass extinctions. You may have heard of some of the reasons or some of the theories behind why there have been mass extinctions in the fossil record. In particular, say, why did the dinosaurs go extinct at that Triassic Cretaceous boundary, and people have speculated maybe there was some extraterrestrial meteor strike on the Earth which pushed the dinosaurs over the edge, and there's been considerable debate about that. Also occurring in the fossil record are these changes, or these increases, rapid increases in biodiversity, and people don't really understand why that has happened. Okay, now you must remember that most of this stuff is generated from the fossil record. It's consistent across many different taxa, both terrestrial and marine, so we know that it is fairly real. So in other words, we know that it is a broad scale effect or process that occurred, but we're really not too sure why. So I'm going to give you some of the reasons why people think that it has happened. Just to repeat what I showed you in the last lecture, this is a graph showing the numbers of terrestrial plant species, fossils, from the Silurian up to the tertiary. So from about 420 million years to about 2 million years. And as you can see, there's a general increase in biodiversity over time. And this increase has been punctuated by a few mass extinction events where plants have showed a massive extinction over the course of several million years before recovering. And by the same token, there's been periods when plants have massively increased in their numbers of species during the fossil record. The last massive increase culminating in the end of the tertiary or the beginning of the quaternary as we live in today. Okay? So what is the reason for some of these massive increases or these sharp increases over the course of several million years of numbers of species? So some of the reasons for the biodiversity explosions which have been proposed, some of the more realistic ones focus on things like breakup of supercontinents, leading to more allopatric evolution and to a greater variety of habitats. Remember, we now accept the hypothesis that the Earth's continents are moving and they drift around on the surface of the Earth, and so that they have not always been in the position that we see them in today. So millions of years ago, the continents were in different positions, and in fact it's been estimated that the continents, given current rates of continental drift, all the continents were joined together into one big supercontinent called Pangaea. That then split into two big continents called Gondwana, which was the southern part, and Laurasia, which was the northern part. And those two supercontinents, the southern and the northern, themselves split up and to give the continents that we see today. Now, with the breakup of these supercontinents, it is thought that populations were separated, leading to populations of species were separated, leading to allopatric evolution. Okay, so that the populations were separated, they could no longer interbreed, so their mutations and environmental conditions changed so that they would evolve into separate and different species. And it's thought that as the supercontinents broke up, more and more isolation of populations occurred so that there were more and more species. Also, it is thought that when the supercontinents broke up, that led to a greater variety of habitats evolving. So with a greater variety of habitats, you would tend to get more and more species evolving to take advantage of these different habitats. Okay? So just to illustrate how the continents have changed their position, or thought to have changed their position over time, as you can see, the first picture shows all the continents clustered together to form the supercontinent Pangaea. Laurasia and Gondwana separate, and then Gondwana splits up. Laurasia splits up into North America and Asia, and the Gondwana has split up, and we're getting close to the types of continents that we see in the world today. Okay, so as the continents split up, more and more species were isolated. India is going to have its own species. Madagascar is going to have its own species. Australia, when it drifts off, has its own species, and so on. So in this way, the numbers of higher and species level taxa increased. But because the oceans were still all joined together, no great change in the diversity of species in the oceans, perhaps, unless there was another process at work. And that is the second point that I have down here. Evolution of adaptations to exploit different niches or to produce more from old ones. Okay? Now what I mean by this is that species would have suffer from mutations which provided adaptations which allowed them to use a resource which they could not previously use. Okay? Confused? Well, this is what I mean. Okay, just imagine that you have a plant which lives in the shallow waters of the coasts of these continents. No plants yet exist which can survive up on land, but we have this plant. And just imagine that that plant has a mutation, okay, which allows it to have a waxy coat around its body. Okay, you see where I'm going with this? This waxy coat around the plant prevents it desiccating. So individuals which have this mutation can now move out of the water and yet retain water within their bodies. Okay, so they are now able to colonize more of the land. Okay, so in that way resources and space and light, more space and light is available to this particular new species. So in that way plants could then start to colonize the land. Okay, so in that way plants are able to access a niche which was previously unavailable to them. Okay, so as time goes on, okay, we have some, if we go back to our graph, maybe we would have around the end of the Devonian period the adaptation of the gymnosperms, which now have a reproductive system which is not reliant on water. So gymnosperms now can colonize much drier habitats. So the numbers of gymnosperms increases, okay, as they are able to utilize these drier habitats. Okay. Another example which is used is the development of flight. Okay, here we have a picture of an insect, a massive dragonfly, okay, reconstructed from the fossil record, and one of the early type of birds evolved from dinosaur raptors in the past. Okay, before the power of flight was developed, the air was effectively a vacant niche, and all the resources which it contained, okay, the ability to fly up to fruit in a tree, okay, for instance. So these resources were effectively closed to the biota, but when the power of flight was developed, then organisms could then utilize the air and other previously inaccessible inaccessible resources. So in that way species, once this mutation occurred, which allowed one species to get onto the land, that species could then diversify into a range of different species, using that same mutation, which allows them to exploit that resource. So evolution then goes in fits and starts. Massive increases in species as a mutation occurs which allows that species to take advantage of that particular niche. We can see an analogue of this in the several stages of succession, or the different stages of succession. If we look at a place like Anak Krakatoa, okay, which is a picture of it down here, it's a small volcanic island which resulted from the explosion of Krakatoa, a larger island, back in the 1800s. This was recorded by the European colonists in the area at the time, and the progress of succession on Anak Krakatoa, which means the son of Krakatoa, has been followed ever since, providing a nice laboratory for people to use. Okay? Now, this serial succession, which occurred over decades, gives an analogue of how plant diversity has occurred in the fossil record. If we look at the different stages of succession, we would start with bare rock, and that's what land probably looked like before plants colonized the surface of the earth. The first plants to colonize the terrestrial regions would have been able to maintain their moisture once out of the water, and they would be probably very simple and low-growing plants like lichens and mosses. Okay, as time went on and mutations built up, competition for light amongst these plants would have led them to get taller and taller until finally the forests that we see today would have developed. Okay? So in each case, a mutation has occurred which allows the plant better access to resources, better competitiveness, and so on, and so increases the number of niches which plants can exploit. Once we get to the forest stage, we have a whole set of plants which can exploit the new understory niche or the new branches niche, and so on. Okay? So it is thought that this global build-up of biodiversity is the result of increases in the number of niches over time, which can be exploited as new and novel mutations occur in the existing biota, which allows the different plants and animals to open up new niches for exploitation. Okay? So that is an explanation of how biodiversity has increased over time in the geological record. Now I want to take a look at some of the theories which are used or invoked to explain why we get diversity in particular ecosystems, and also to explain why diversity or biodiversity is higher in some parts of the earth than in other parts of the earth. Okay, so for instance, the tropical rainforests are some of the most biodiverse ecosystems, but structurally very similar ecosystems, say in Western Europe, are not half as biodiverse as these tropical rainforests. Why is that? I want to go through some of these theories which have been erected to explain that. Now I want to point out that these theories are derived from certain particular instances that people have observed in different types of ecosystems. It is likely that these theories, some of these theories would apply in particular instances, but not all instances. Okay? And that maybe in some cases, some of these theories apply to some taxa in that particular ecosystem, but not to others. Or that these theories may be, or hypotheses, may be applicable in some cases, but not in others. Okay? So, Species, the first of the theories that we have here is the stability time hypothesis. And this hypothesis goes that species richness should be correlated with the length of time an ecosystem has been stable on a geological, annual, and daily time scale. And the basic predication of this one is that the longer the niche remains stable or remains the same, the more likely an organism will evolve to specialize in it. Okay? So the idea is that if a niche exists and exists unchanged for thousands of years, you will inevitably get some organism which evolves to exploit that niche, okay, and specialize in it. Okay? If that niche vanishes because of, say, global climate change or because of glaciation or something like that, then the organism, the species which specialized in that niche, will also vanish. Okay? So if the niche remains stable and unchanging through time, okay, you will get a build-up of species, each exploiting their own niche. Okay? Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, the stability time hypothesis on a geological scale, okay, and we can think of it on different time scales, geological, annual, and daily time scales. On a geological scale, okay, this process is thought to be a historical process. Okay, so in terms of the process, it's a historical biogeographical process. Okay, the processes which maintain diversity through niche stability on an annual and daily basis would be more ecological processes. Okay, so let's look at stability in geological time. How does stability of niches and environments in geological time, which is a historical effect, influence biodiversity? So on a regional timescale, tropical regions have been more stable than temperate regions. Temperate regions have been disturbed or destroyed even by repeated glaciations, and they have to be recolonized by tropical species because they're basically sterilized by these tons of ice overlaying the land. Okay? So this is one explanation of why there is much greater numbers of species in tropical regions than there are in temperate regions. The theory goes that the temperate regions have been effectively wiped out periodically, and the last time that the temperate regions were wiped out was about 10,000 years ago. Maybe at the height of the last glaciation was about 20,000 years ago, and it had finished by about 15 to 10,000 years ago. Okay? So the temperate regions have been disturbed and destroyed by repeated glaciations, but the tropical regions have not. They retain their species, okay, and those tropical species have recolonized the temperate regions after the glaciers have retreated back to the ice caps and they've melted. Okay, so because of that, the tropical areas have had their niches constant for a much longer time. Other environments on the Earth which have similarly been stable are deep sea environments. These have been very stable. As you can imagine, at the bottom of the ocean, because it has been buffered by a couple of thousand meters of water from any sort of temperature changes and other environmental changes, it's remained unchanging for millions and millions of years, untouched even by glaciations, for example. Okay? It's only when the Titanic sunk that it got disturbed. Ha ha ha. So deep sea environments have been very stable, and they have also proved to be also very biodiverse as well. So when they've done samples of the deep sea fauna on the sea floor, because they do tend to be consumers of the detritus which rains down from the upper region, there really is no primary producers except around deep sea vents which spit out sulfur and which can be metabolized. But generally they're detritivores, and they've existed in a very stable environment, so they've been able to specialize in different parts of those deep sea environments and also different patches of the deep sea environments. So grab samples of sediment from deep sea environments very close together have shown almost entirely different communities, okay, over a very small area. So it's thought that these environments have huge numbers of, say, nematodes and other detritivorous animals. Okay, let's move on now to annual stability. Now this is an ecological effect. Okay, it has it started to occur and became stable around the middle of the end of the last ice age, after the end of the last ice age. Okay, on an annual time scale from over the course of the year, tropical regions tend to be much less seasonal, particularly with respect to temperature. So within the tropics there is no freezing, okay, at least at sea level, and the temperature is pretty much constant throughout the year. Okay, very stable. Within tropical regions, there are some parts of the tropics which have rainfall throughout the year, so the precipitation is stable, and within those you would tend to get your tropical rainforests. Okay, in the areas where you tend to get more seasonal rainfall, there would be deciduous forests and savannas. When you look at the diversity of tropical regions compared to temperate regions, tropical regions are much more diverse, and it's thought that this annual stability contributes to this. So for instance, you would get birds in the tropical region which can specialize on just eating fruit. In the temperate regions, there is part of the year during the winter or early summer when fruit is just not available. So those birds which live in the temperate regions must be able to generalize and eat insects as well, okay, which fills other niches with the same species. In the tropical regions, you would just have a species eating fruit and then a different species eating insects. So in that way, the numbers of species can be magnified in an annually stable environment like a tropical rainforest. Okay, and this is magnified even more in a rainforest where the rainfall is constant throughout the year. In a seasonal forest, you would tend to get fewer species because species have to cope with the dryness of the dry season. Okay, and same with savannas. So annual stability allows more specialists in a single constantly available resource. Okay, so you would tend to get more niches. Now let's move on to diurnal stability. Okay, this again is an ecological effect which has come into being at the from the end of the last ice age. There is daily stability is also greater in the tropics, except in upland areas. So the diurnal variation in temperature in the tropics tends to be less than you would tend to get in temperate regions, particularly on coastal areas. Okay? The exception is tropical montane areas, which can have a winter every night and a summer during the day, constantly, day after day. So the temperature at the top of some of these tropical montane regions gets down to freezing, and ice freezes, and then during the day temperatures get up to 35 degrees and everything just gets hot and desiccated. Okay, so that is diurnal instability. So you can see a gradient of diversity, biodiversity, from lowland areas where the temperatures are very stable over a 24-hour period, and the montane areas where temperatures fall to a great degree. There's massive ranges in temperature. Okay? So to cope with these extremes in temperature, animals and plants need to have special adaptations, and that means special mutations, which means that there are much fewer species in these areas than there are in the more stable diurnal habitats. Okay? We must also take into account the geological stability of montane areas, or the geological instability of montane areas. Like temperate areas, tropical montane areas have been repeatedly disturbed by glaciation. They've been covered by mountains, and that probably leads to a decrease in biodiversity in these areas that we observe today. However, recolonization of these areas has probably been quicker because the tropical vegetation and plants and animals are closer to these tropical montane areas than they are to, say, glaciated North America, for instance. Okay? Let's move on now to a different hypothesis which has been erected to explain differences in biodiversity around the world. This one is known as the productivity hypothesis. This is another ecological effect, maintaining biodiversity, and it explains higher biodiversity by saying that species richness should be correlated to productivity. In other words, the higher the primary productivity of an ecosystem, the greater the numbers of species. And it is argued that if you have a larger amount of energy, okay, that amount of energy can be shared out amongst a larger number of individuals. Okay, so each individual needs a certain amount of energy to make its biomass, to carry out its metabolic functions and so on. Okay, there's a point below which there simply isn't enough energy to maintain an animal. Okay, if you have a large amount of energy, you have a greater number of individuals. If you have a greater number of individuals, that means that each species can have a greater number of individuals. So that means that higher productivity means larger populations for more species. And when it comes to, as we will see later in the lectures on extinction, when it comes to assessing whether a species will go extinct or not, one of the primary reasons why a species will go extinct is that its population is too small to survive chance events and so on. If you have a larger population, then you are much more likely to survive. So a larger population of a species means it is much less likely to go extinct, okay, and therefore the species are more likely to persist. So when another species mutates and changes and speciates to a different species, the original species is still going to be around. Okay, so therefore in a high productivity environment, it's thought that species build-up is maintained. Okay, so tropical areas with year-round warm temperatures and year-round rainfall have high rates of primary productivity and therefore high biodiversity. Again, this would explain why tropical rainforests would tend to have very high biodiversity. Another point is that more energy is available for reproduction, allowing greater increase in numbers of species than developing adaptations to cope with adverse conditions. Okay? There is some examples which do not seem to follow this hypothesis. They may be very highly productive ecosystems but with very low biodiversity or lower biodiversities. So things like mangroves, for instance, are very productive ecosystems. However, they are dominated by only a few species of trees, unlike any other tropical forest that you get. The reason for that, of course, is thought to be that you need very specific adaptations to allow these plants to grow in saline water. Okay? And not many species have been able to develop those adaptations as yet. Okay? Seagrass beds are similarly very high productivity but very low biodiversity. Again, these are environments which are quite challenging in terms of their abiotic conditions. I mean, estuaries are very saline, seagrass beds grow underwater, hot springs are at the bottom of the deep blue sea, so they also spit out a cocktail of chemicals which are used by the primary producers. Okay, so they're challenging environments, and that even though they are highly productive, they have not got large numbers of species. Another area where this productivity hypothesis falls down is in areas where there is very high soil fertility. Okay, when there is high soil fertility and greater primary production, there actually tends to be lower biodiversity. Okay, and some of the reasons why this is explained is that the species which are best able to produce with high fertility tend to take over the ecosystem. Okay, why this doesn't occur everywhere, we just don't know. And it seems that intermediate levels of fertility or intermediate levels of productivity tend to be the most biodiverse. Okay? All right, let's move on to our next theory of biodiversity regulation. This one says that a more structurally diverse habitat will tend to have more biodiversity. Okay? And basically the reason behind this is that a more structurally diverse habitat would tend to have many more niches than a simple habitat. So for instance, if you compare a forest to a grassland, now a forest has niches which forest floor, the trunk of the tree, the branches of the tree, the tops of the tree, all very distinct, different abiotic habitats. Okay, so you can get species if those niches are stable, then you can get species which specialize in all those different habitats. Okay, so when you compare the numbers of species of, say, birds in a forest habitat, it tends to be much higher than the number of species of birds, say, in a grassland habitat, which is much more structurally simple. It just has the grass and then nothing. Okay? Forest would have understory vegetation, mid-story vegetation, saplings and seedlings, and trees. Okay? So a structurally diverse plant community means more animal biodiversity. And this works out very well for bird biodiversity. There are a number of papers which have been published which compares or correlates the bird diversity with foliage height diversity. So if there's foliage at many different heights in the canopy, then you're going to have high bird biodiversity, because the birds are able to specialize in the different parts. It doesn't work so well for other taxa, however. For instance, lizard biodiversity tends to be greater in more simple ecosystems, like in hot deserts. Okay, and that's mainly because lizards will tend to be able to take advantage of energy from the sun directly, so they don't like shade as much, and they would get more productivity with less vegetation. Okay, so structural hypothesis, like the productivity hypothesis, works in some ecosystems but does not seem to work in others. Okay, the next theory of biodiversity regulation is density-dependent predation. Okay? Now, one of the fundamental theories of Western ecology is that competition should drive species to exclude less competitive species from an ecosystem. So basically what this hypothesis states is that if two species are both competing for the same resource, the most competitive species will outcompete the less competitive species and drive it from the ecosystem. Okay? Now, people have observed in tropical rainforests, for instance, that, say, tropical trees all seem to be competing for the same resource, and yet the diversity of tropical trees in a tropical rainforest is very high. You would seldom find an ecosystem in a tropical forest which is dominated by any one species. So there must be some mechanism to keep the strong competitive trees in check, okay, so that they don't force out the lesser competitors. Okay? So therefore, in summary then, competition in theory should reduce biodiversity, but this does not happen, okay, in tropical areas. Why is that? And so biodiversity is maintained. So why does this happen? It's thought that competition is being held in check by predation. Okay? As soon as a species starts to dominate the ecosystem, it increases in number, increases in biomass, begins to monopolize the other species for itself, predation starts to take over. Though the very highly competitive species, in their high numbers, increased numbers, themselves represent a resource for predators to use. Okay? So what happens is that a predator, whether it be an insect or so on, will find that particular very competitive species, and it will be able to specialize in eating that very competitive species, and it goes through and wipes out the population or reduces the population of that very competitive species, allowing the other species to come through and capture their share of the resources. Okay? So in that way, predation acts as a check on the very competitive overachievers in the ecosystem, leaving room for other species. Okay? So density dependent predation would only apply in ecosystems or environments which have good supply of resources, so that highly competitive species can breed up. Okay? And in those cases, predation must be used to prevent, or are used to prevent, biodiversity being made extinct by those highly competitive species. It's actually been shown in some ecosystems, however, that predation can prevent biodiversity build-up by removing species with small population sizes. So if a population tries to colonize a particular area, it initially is going to have a small population size. If a predator moves against that, species before it gets in a large enough population, it will be wiped out. So in some cases, predation can prevent biodiversity buildup by removing species which come in and colonize before they can build up large enough and sustainable population sizes. Okay? But generally, predation can act to maintain diversity in a tropical ecosystem. Another way in which competition can be controlled is by disturbance. And this is the basis of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. Okay? It's effectively a modification of the density-dependent predation hypothesis. Instead, abiotic disturbance takes the place of predation. So some sort of abiotic disturbance, whether it be a tree fall, death, a fire, or a hurricane, or grazing, takes the place of predation. Okay? So there's a balance between productivity and disturbance. So disturbance will periodically come through and remove the larger competitors and allow space for other species to survive. Okay? So that competitive exclusion is not allowed to proceed to its end point. So the types of disturbance that we would be things like grazing. I guess that's a biotic effect, but it's a biotic effect. I shouldn't really put grazing in. Things like river meandering, tree fall gaps and falling down, hurricanes and fire, they all produce a periodic disturbance, okay, which can reduce the impact of these competitive species and allow a more mixed species to survive. So periodic disturbance can reduce the diversity in some cases, however, if it is too frequent. Okay, if periodic disturbance like fire or hurricanes is too frequent, it may not allow some species to grow up to a large enough size to reproduce. So if periodic disturbance is too frequent, then species which are more K-selected, take a long time to reproduce, may be excluded from the ecosystem. So too frequent periodic disturbance can reduce biodiversity. But less frequent, say once every 20, once every 30 years, disturbance may actually increase biodiversity by maintaining the competitive species at a low enough level. Okay, so that's some of the different hypotheses which have been erected to explain biodiversity, okay, and in particular to explain why some areas are more biodiverse than other areas. Okay, so I will see you next week. Bye-bye now.